I pulled into the gravel 5 minutes early like I always do. The lot was packed tight. People moved inside in soft creams and silvers, the kind of clothes that make a room hush. I sat for a moment, hand curled around a small velvet box in my lap. The box felt heavier than it looked. Inside were 2 rings, not mine to wear, but Logan had asked me to bring them, said the family rings ought to be passed along. He wanted meaning. I wanted to honor him. I stepped out of the car and took a breath that went shallow and thin. The air smelled like cut grass and incense. My shoes made little sounds on the gravel as I walked toward the chapel. Halfway there I stopped. Logan was already standing by the doors, sharp in a suit he must have changed into at the last minute. He looked close to stiff, like he'd been holding a shape inside him for too long. Avery stood beside him, calm and perfect, her smile practiced tight. Her eyes slid over me and kept going, as if they were trained to ignore what they saw. Logan moved quickly, closing the space between us. He blocked the doorway with his body and his voice was low when he spoke. "Mom," he said, "this isn't the right moment." My stomach folded small. I lifted the velvet box because I had to. "You forgot these," I told him. He took the box without touching my fingers, like he could pass the thing without passing the feeling. "She's just very nervous," he said, eyes away from mine. "Avery wanted a small ceremony today, peaceful. Maybe it's better if you step away." I wanted to argue. Instead my throat made a sound, an AWH that came out too soft to be heard by the crowd inside. I didn't cry. I nodded, one tiny, measured motion, and said, "Have a beautiful day." Then I turned and walked back to the car. Driving away the road ribboned through orchards I know by heart. The trees leaned in the wind like old neighbors leaning closer to listen. I kept both hands on the wheel. My face was dry, my fingers were steady. At home I hung my coat in the same place as always. The house took me in like a thing that never keeps score. I made tea, set one cup on the table, and sat. The kettle hissed and left a quiet in the room where a cry might have lived. It didn't come. I told no one. My silence said what I didn't want to say out loud. Morning came with a phone that buzzed on the 3rd ring. Logan's voice was lighter than the day before, practiced again but softer. "The photographer wants to take portraits this afternoon," he said. "We were thinking the orchard would be perfect. The light, the trees, it would mean a lot." I looked at the brass key on its ring by the mug. The tag faded but my father's handwriting still legible. "You want the orchard?" I asked. "Just for pictures," he said. "Avery loves the wild rose near the fence. We'll be quick." I kept my voice steady. "Ask your wife," I said. There was a pause long enough to feel like a small room opened between us. Eventually, "All right," he said. "We'll keep it short." He hung up before I could change my mind. I sat with cold tea and listened to the wind scatter pale blossoms across the porch. The world outside went about its ordinary small miracles. Inside, everything felt rearranged. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like a person looking for a misplaced thought. My feet found the old study out back, my husband's study, and the smell of its old books reached into me the way a hand finds a familiar pocket. The desk light was off. The chair sat slightly crooked. A bottom drawer, the one my husband always kept latched, was pulled out a finger's width. Someone had been searching. I crouched and slid it open. Maps and folders leaned at odd angles. The recent boundary survey for the north field, the one that showed the new parcel we'd added, was not where it should have been. An empty space yawned at the top of a neat stack. I found a small carved compartment I'd forgotten my father had put in the shelf. My hand brushed a thin, brittle envelope sealed and yellowed. My father's handwriting wrote Marin on the front and only if needed below it. I sat in the old chair and opened the envelope slow enough to keep my heart from sounding like thunder. Inside was a short letter and a notarized clause my father had added years ago. Administrative control of the estate rested with me alone unless I signed it away. No shared authority, no bypass, nothing that could be quietly shifted by others. I folded the papers back into their envelope and took them to my bedroom. From the top shelf I lifted a metal box that kept birth certificates and our marriage license. I slid the letter into that box with the deed and the original papers and locked it with the small key on my chain. The house felt awake in a different way then, not threatened, not sleeping, just expectant. Late that night, curiosity pulled me toward the laptop. I don't often scroll through social feeds, but I wanted to see the wedding pictures, maybe the faces I'd missed. Avery had already posted. There she was in white, light breaking off the hem of her dress, Logan behind her with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. The caption read something polished and shining: perfect start, perfect place, perfect family, no disruptions. There was no mention of me. No hint that I had been standing 5 feet away holding the rings. The ring box I had carried felt like a relic from another life. The land under their feet, the history threaded through those fields, it all looked as though I'd never been here. A small bitterness rose like a laugh that wanted to be angry instead. Ha ha ha, I thought, because the world has a way of rearranging who belongs in the story. I closed the laptop and reached up for my keys, fingers finding the worn brass as if touching a talisman. The next day would bring visitors, and a polite front from those who wanted what I had tended. For now the orchard lay quiet, petals on the porch like tiny flags that marked the place where something had already begun to change. Wait until you hear what someone else finds in the study days later. It will turn everything I thought I knew upside down. They came back the next morning with a small army of politeness. First there was Logan, looking too tired for the suit he'd worn before. Then Avery, clipboard tucked to her chest like armor. Behind them walked 2 men in plain, expensive suits who moved like their steps had been practiced for porches. I opened the door before they reached it because waiting makes room for speeches. They sat at the kitchen table like visitors who believed the house would offer them tea. I stayed standing. Avery smiled first, the way someone who's rehearsed a story starts the script. We've been thinking about the orchard and the house, she said. It has so much potential. Rustic weddings, retreats, photography, people ask all the time. With a little investment this place could support all of us. She spoke in tidy, gentle sentences that were meant to sound like care. Logan filled in the blanks. Maintenance is costly, the land could provide security, this would be good for everyone. The younger lawyer opened a folder and slid a stack of papers across the table: numbers, projections, firm language. The air tasted of printer ink and something metallic. I listened. I let their words hang in the room like streamers. Step by step I watched them try to narrow my world to a spreadsheet. First they painted the problem: upkeep, taxes, depreciation. Then they offered the solution: sell or convert, take the risk out of my hands. Finally they proposed the kindness: move to a comfortable cottage, be near town, community care. Everything phrased as a favor. When they finished, Logan reached for my hand without asking. I didn't give it to him. Instead I walked out to the porch and picked up a single envelope from my pocket, the one I'd found in the study, then unfolded it slowly and placed the notarized deed on top of their stack. My name was alone on the line that mattered: administrative control until my death or by my written decision. My father's signature curved beneath it like a promise. There was a pause the size of a held breath. The younger lawyer frowned. That clause can be challenged, he said. Then challenge it, I replied. There was a flutter at the edges of Avery's practiced smile, irritation, surprise, something that looked like panic for a beat. Logan's jaw tightened. The lawyers gathered their folders. They slid the paper stack back toward them, folded their hands politely, and left. After they went I did 3 things in quick order, as if making lists in my head would settle the shaking under my skin. First, I closed and bolted the gate behind them so no one could stroll back up unannounced. Second, I locked the envelope and deed inside the metal box with the rest of the estate papers and slid the key under the little pile of mail I kept by the bedside. Small, private actions that felt like assembling a shield. Third, I didn't celebrate. There was no triumph, only an odd sort of exhaustion and a small laugh that started in the throat and ended in something like relief. Ha ha ha, because sometimes surviving the first round is nothing more than not breaking. 2 days later Henry, our old family lawyer, drove up alone. He's retired now, knees a little stiff from gardening, cat food stains on his cardigan sometimes, but his eyes still look like someone who reads fine print for breakfast. He'd found a folder in his attic, one of those, just in case, things my father used to leave. He put it on his desk and told me it was meant for me only if people started moving with suits and smiles. I opened Henry's envelope at his kitchen table while he watched, slow and careful. Inside was a short letter from my father. He wrote bluntly, Marin, if someone is talking you out of what you've earned, don't let them. Protect it. Protect yourself. No legal jargon. Only the kind of clear, old-fashioned instruction my father used to give when he wanted me to remember something. Don't surrender to charm, don't trade history for convenience. That night I did more practical things, the kind that feel small but actually build a fortress. I updated the will with language that closed loopholes: no transfer without consent, No guardianship clauses that could be exercised without my say, explicit boundaries for inheritance. Next, I called my doctor and asked for copies of my recent tests and records. Step by step. Know the papers that could be used against you, then make sure you have your own. Control, I reminded myself as I wrote dates and names on a notepad, isn't about showing power to others. It's preparation, it's peace. I slept on the porch that night with a mug in my hands and the wind through the trees like an old lullaby. The orchard felt different, not threatened, but watched over in the way an animal watches its young. Somewhere between the chest-tight ache and the stubborn steadiness, a kind of resolve took root. I would not be hurried off the land I'd kept. I would not be convinced by polished smiles. But Henry slid one more paper across the table as I left. I glanced at it, and the color left my face. There was a name on a single line I wasn't expecting, and it suggested someone had been making plans long before the polite faces arrived on my porch. What that name meant would change everything I thought I'd already handled. Read on to find out who had been working in the shadows. Henry pushed a thin sheet of paper across the table like he was handing me a key. I blinked and read the single line. Marcus Reed, call if there's trouble with heirs or coercion. The name sat there in black ink like someone had left a light on in a storm. My first breath came out small and sharp. Marcus Reed. The words felt like a rope thrown from a boat. I remembered the name, an old friend of my father's, a judge once, the sort of man who kept a steady, exacting gaze and never let people hurry him. He'd been the type who read contracts the way others read love letters, carefully, looking for what wasn't there as much as what was. Henry's face softened when he saw the way I looked at the paper. He told me Marcus had helped my father sort out messy affairs once, quietly, without spectacle. He kept the contact in his files in case the family ever needed someone blunt and honest. I folded the paper and tucked it in my pocket. For the first time in days a plan formed that felt like real armor. Not dramatic gestures, step by step, sensible things that might actually stop a scheme. Step 1. Call Marcus. Step 2. Get him to come and see the papers. The notarized clause my father had filed, the updated will I'd just rewritten, everything in order. Step 3. Make sure the legal record shows I was acting, aware, and asserting control. Ha ha ha. The little laugh that escaped me sounded like someone surprised to find their voice still worked for them. I called Marcus from Henry's kitchen while Henry made coffee like nothing unusual was happening. Marcus answered in a voice that was all calm and contained history. When I told him what had arrived at my door, suits, folders, promises of cottages, he didn't ask questions that wasted breath. He said he'd be there within the day. That steadiness did something quiet in my chest. AWH, I thought, because help had arrived not like a rescue but like a tool I could hold and use. While I waited, I made a list of what Marcus would need. I gathered the deed, the notarized clause, the will updates, the old maps from the study where the missing survey had been noticed, and Henry's envelope. I made copies, 3 sets, neat and labeled. I wrote down dates and times of visits, what each visitor had said, and when the social posts had gone up. Step by step, paper by paper, I turned memory into evidence. It felt oddly fierce to be so methodical. You can cry and still file a document, I told myself. You can ache and still make photocopies. When Marcus arrived, he did not come in with a flourish. He drove up in a small fixer of a car that showed its age like a proud scar. He walked the porch with slow steps, looked at the gate, the orchard, and then at me as if cataloging what mattered. We went through the papers at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floorboards. Marcus read the notarized clause, the will, the maps, and Henry's note. He nodded without surprise. He knew my father. He knew how my father thought about land. This clause is solid, he said finally, voice level. It sets administrative control clearly, not impossible to contest, but you have a strong hand if you make it clear you're acting and others are trying to push you off the property. He suggested immediate steps. Send a certified letter to Logan and Avery stating you are asserting your administrative authority and that no transactions will be entered without your written consent. Request a meeting with a court clerk to make sure your updated will and the notarized clause are on file. And, if necessary, have Marcus draft a short affidavit that places the facts on the record, the visitors, the proposals, the tone of coercion. He also suggested something I hadn't thought to ask for, an impartial inventory. Marcus wanted a third-party appraisal of the estate's financials and maintenance needs so there would be no room for the kind of slippery language accountants sometimes use to scare people into selling. That felt wise. I felt a small, fierce pride when he said it. I can do this, I thought. I can make the truth look like the truth on paper. Word travels fast. By the time Marcus had left, having promised to be ready if the lawyers pushed back, there were already more cars on the lane. Avery's visits became more frequent and thinner at the edges, as if she were testing the fence to see whether it still stood. She called more often, voice syrupy when she thought I might be weakening, brisk when she thought pressure might work. Logan's calls went quiet. Once, he rang and asked if we could talk with less formality, just to clear the air. I agreed and we spoke in the slow, careful way people do when something delicate might break. Marcus's presence changed the dynamic like a new chord struck in a room. Avery's smile tightened. Logan's apologies became less sure. The lawyers who had come with polished papers now seemed to measure their steps. Things felt balanced on a line, and I felt the world hold its breath in that space. But Marcus left with a look I couldn't read. When I asked him later, he hesitated and said something soft, almost a warning. There are always people who think they can rewrite the past if they can control the present. He would help, he said, but he reminded me that law doesn't unmake family. It simply makes clear who holds what right now. His tone suggested there might be another layer I hadn't seen. Something tied between Logan and those polite folders that went deeper than a late-night persuasion. Marcus's pause said more than his words. I folded the papers again, tucked them into the metal box, and slid the key into my palm. The orchard outside seemed steadier, as if the trees themselves had taken a breath. I felt protected by paper and by a man who had once kept my father honest. Still, a question thudded. What did Marcus know about Logan that made him hesitate? That hesitation suggested a secret or a debt or a shame. And secrets, I knew, have a way of deciding how stories end. Next, I'll show what Marcus found when he quietly ran a background check, and what that discovery meant for Logan, for Avery, and for the choices everyone thought were already made. Marcus did what he does best without drama. He read, he walked, he matched dates to signatures, and he listened to the small sounds history makes when it's being unearthed. He came back with a folder that smelled faintly of copier toner and rain, and when he set it on my kitchen table the pages fell like a small confession. He'd pulled 3 things together first. Email chains between Logan and a Holt development account, a string of wire transfers that didn't have Marin on the paperwork, and formation documents for a new LLC whose name echoed the venue idea, Holt Orchard Events LLC. The emails were polite and precise, the kind of messages people send when they want a thing to look inevitable. Logan had written about moving things forward and securing operational oversight. In one note he'd suggested, casually, that Marin might be happier in town and that a graceful transition would be best for everyone. The language was butter smooth, the intent was a blade. Second, Marcus had flagged timing. The wire transfers had been made in small, repeatable sums over months, a drip of money that, in the aggregate, became substantial. The transfers were labeled in the ledger as consulting or advisory in the developer's books. On paper, no crime. In practice, a pay for persuasion that meant someone with skin in the family was being financially rewarded for pushing a sale. I felt my lungs pull tight. The air in the kitchen felt thin and metallic. I wanted to laugh at the neatness of it all. Ha ha ha, of course it would be this tidy. And then the laugh cracked because tidy doesn't make betrayal less sharp. Third, there were signatures. Someone had prepared documents that would have allowed for an expedited lease and management transfer if a person with authority signed. The signatures on the drafts were Logan's in places where my name should have been needed. They were drafts, not executed. They'd been kept ready, though, like a letter left on the table for an absent person to sign when they least expected it. Marcus explained plainly and painfully. The notarized clause my father filed and the updates to my will were strong, but they don't stop people from trying to edge you out by creating a narrative of incapacity or of, for everyone's good. The money trail suggested motive. The drafts suggested intent. The emails suggested a plan to make transition look voluntary. All that packaged together meant this wasn't just a family squabble, it was coordinated pressure. We moved step by step because anger without a plan is theater. Marcus set out the immediate, simple actions that would make the facts smell less like someone's rumor and more like evidence the law could use. File for an injunction to prevent any transfer, sale, or contracts tied to the orchard while the dispute is resolved. That would freeze the developer's ability to act and buy time. Serve a formal notice to Logan and Avery that any further financial dealings tied to the property are to cease and that their communications and transactions would be reviewed. A clear, legal request for preservation of evidence, no shredding, no deleting emails. Trace the bank transfers formally through a subpoena if the developers resisted providing documents voluntarily. Marcus said it bluntly. Paperwork will tell the truth if you force the hand that hides it. Publicly lodge a factual statement with the court that outlines dates, visitors, emails, and wire transfers, a simple affidavit that won't be poetic but will be clear and difficult to dismiss as misunderstanding. Prepare a measured public message in case the developers tried to spin the story, not a press conference, Marcus said, but a short, honest statement that Marin is asserting her rights and has sought counsel. Every legal step was a calm work of preparation, but emotionally the proof hit like a tide. I felt the hollow ache of betrayal where trust used to sit. Logan had been part of the bedtime stories, the arguing over the fence posts, the shared mugs on foggy mornings. Now a neat set of emails turned his voice into a ledger entry. My eyes filled before my breath caught. I let them, because the house knew how to hold small griefs. Marcus folded the files back into the folder and met my eyes. You don't have to burn the bridge to keep the land, he said quietly. You don't have to publicize the hurts you feel if you'd rather keep them private. But you do need to make it impossible for them to walk over you while they count the coins. AWH. The small softness of that reassurance cracked something open. It felt like someone handing you a tool when your hands have gone numb. That afternoon, while Marcus drafted the first letters, I sat by the window and watched the sun spill gold across the orchard. The leaves trembled with the same slow, faithful rhythm they always had. To them this was an odd season. To me, it felt like standing in the center of a storm I'd only just seen forming. At dusk, after the first legal notices were sent, the car lights on the lane blinked like distant fireflies, people moving about their business in the evening. I was folding a map when someone knocked at the front door. The sound was a single, precise rap that tightened the chest. I didn't expect visitors, not tonight. When I opened the door there was no one I recognized, only a small, plain courier envelope on the step, unstamped and unaddressed. Inside was a single bank statement, photocopied, showing a recent large transfer into Logan's private account labeled in a way that made motive look like math. How the envelope arrived at my door without a name tied it to someone who wanted this found rather than hidden. The thought made heat rise under the skin of my cheeks. Was it an ally, a whistleblower, or something else entirely? I closed the door with the papers in my hand and felt both the small triumph of discovery and the deep, weary sorrow of proof. The evidence was now not only legal, but intimate, a ledger that would not let love be an excuse. Logan had to be confronted with this. He would need to answer, to me, to Marcus, to the record. But before I could decide how to use the statement, another knock sounded, softer this time, like someone choosing their words outside a bedroom door. When I opened the window to the porch a breath of night reached in and with it a voice I hadn't expected to hear again, quiet and small, hollow with something like apology. The voice came from someone who had been part of the plan and who might have the one thing that could change why it started in the first place. If you think the ledger is the final truth, wait until you hear what that voice tells me. It will twist the story from a neat ledger into a tangle of old debts, secrets, and a confession no one saw coming. The knock at the door had been a small sound, precise. The voice at the window was softer, edged with something like fear. When I drew back the curtain, a woman stood on the porch with her coat wrapped tight and her hands tucked so she could not offer them as evidence of guilt or sympathy. She looked younger than I expected, tired in that way people get when they've been keeping a secret too long. Her name was Rosa, she said, and when she spoke her words came out in quick little pieces, like someone removing bandages. She'd worked for Holt Development as an administrative assistant for 2 years, she began, voice barely louder than the hush of the evening. She'd filed papers, scanned invoices, run errands, made coffee. She'd seen the small transactions move through accounts. She had nothing to gain by telling me, she insisted, she was tired of being used. I let her talk because the house had room for new noises now, honest ones that landed differently. Rosa laid the bank photocopy on my kitchen table, then slid another paper across beside it, an internal memo from the developer's office with Logan's name on an email chain. She explained step by careful step, pointing to lines I'd already read but that now took on a different shade. Logan had been paid in small sums, yes, but he hadn't signed the checks with a calm, scheming hand. He'd accepted them because the developers had promised they would help with a situation he couldn't fix himself. At first I felt the hot, immediate rush of betrayal, blood loud in my ears, The old stinging that says you were used. Ha ha ha. The thought that Rose felt bitter and surprised all at once. But then Rosa said the words that made the ache in my chest split in two. Logan had a debt. Not gambling, not bad business. His son needed surgery, an operation overseas, insurance that didn't cover everything. The kind of bills that turn love into a ledger. Rosa told me she'd seen Logan in the office one night, eyes hollow, promising to do whatever it took to keep his family afloat. In the ledger he'd been careful, writing, consulting, next to sums that had come in at odd hours. He'd told the developers one thing, the developers had told him another. They offered money in exchange for subtle influence, a friendly word at a gate, a suggestion here, a smile and a nod at the right time. Logan had taken it because he felt trapped between love and an empty bank account. Listening, I felt a wash of things, fire, sting, and then an odd soft melt at the edges. AWH. The sound I hadn't meant to make escaped me like a small, private thing. I remembered Logan as he'd been when the boy was born, small and fierce and clumsy with joy. I remembered nights when he'd sat up with the child, humming nonsense songs. I had watched him grow from a young man into someone whose shoulders practiced responsibility until they ached. Rosa kept talking. She said she'd left a copy of the memo on my step because she couldn't look at the faces of the people at the office anymore. She was tired of pressing the copy button on papers that would be used to make a friendly theft look like kindness. She wanted me to know, she said, because she hoped I might make a choice she felt powerless to make. That confession did something complicated inside me. Betrayal and compassion are strange bedfellows. They can share a room and not speak to each other, and yet their steps echo on the same floor. My hands trembled as I took the papers. The kitchen light made the ink on the memo look like a confession written in a language I wanted to unlearn. Logan had been cornered by love, then pushed by money that smelled like a solution. That knowledge did not excuse the deceit, but it softened the edges in a way that made my anger ache with pity. Step by step, I thought of the practical things I could do and the human ones I had to consider. The legal path was narrow and clear. The evidence Rosa had given could be added to the file Marcus had begun to build. The wire transfers, the emails, the memo, all of it would place motive like a bright flag in the record. Marcus would want the memo, the photocopies, Rosa's willingness to testify if necessary. He would draft a request for subpoena that would pull the full bank records and make the developers show their hands entirely. But there were other steps that were not legal but mattered just as much. I could call Logan right away and confront him with facts, not accusations shouted like knives, but the slow, steady presentation of things that could not be untold. Or I could wait, let Marcus move quietly so that evidence would not be shredded or hidden, and then bring Logan in with the lawyers present so his answers could be recorded. I could storm outward in fury and demand restitution, or I could fold my arms and create space for the son and the man who had once been my partner. Both choices felt like a form of violence, both felt like a way to heal. I put the memo in the metal box with the other papers and shut the lid like closing a wound. Marcus needed to see Rosa's statement. Henry needed to file his notes. I told Rosa I would protect her as best I could because bravery deserves shelter. She laughed with a small nod, and the way her coat hugged her thin frame made me ache with a tenderness I did not expect. Later, when I dialed Logan, my voice was not all one thing. It had a careful softness threaded with a firmness that had been honed over the past week. He answered slowly. I asked him plainly if what Rosa had said was true. There was a long silence, and then a sound that might have been weeping caught in his throat. He did not speak for a moment, as if searching for the words that might not make the break easier. When he finally spoke, he said, yes. He said the boy needed help and he had been foolish. He said he'd tried to do it without me because pride made him blind. He apologized, and the apology had in it the weight of a man who had made a bad choice to keep a promise. That admission made the world look different. The ledger did not vanish. The emails did not evaporate. The memo still existed like a scar. But the person beneath the documents looked human in a way that made rage and mercy sit at the same table across from each other and refuse to choose. I told Logan I would not rush, that Marcus would be in touch, that this would be handled with the law and with truth. I also told him the one thing that felt like a necessary boundary. If help had been taken in secret, there would be consequences for trust. He said he understood. His voice was small and raw. AWH, the sound he made later when he left the porch, it was part apology, part grief. That night I lay awake with the papers spread like a constellation across the bedside table. Ha ha ha. A laugh rose again, not from joy but from the absurdity that life asks us to know both villain and victim in the same breath. I realized something important in the dark. Protecting the land was not only about a title on paper. It was about choosing how to hold the people who live in its shadow once the truth is visible. My father's claws and Marcus's subpoenas could stop the sale. They could not, alone, decide what forgiveness tasted like or where trust could be rebuilt. The next morning, Marcus arrived with a plan that balanced law and the fragile human mess it must sometimes contain. He wanted to subpoena bank records, to demand full disclosure, to preserve Rose's statement with an affidavit. He also suggested a mediated meeting with Logan present, a neutral space where truth could be spoken and accountability mapped out. But before any of that, there was one other document Rosa had hinted at, a small, unsigned note she'd seen on a desk in the developer's office, something that suggested the developers expected Logan's compliance and had drafted a thank you speech before any agreement was signed. If that note existed, it meant the plan had been rehearsed without him knowing the full cost. Marcus said he'd find it. I watched him leave and felt like the orchard itself was holding its breath. When I swung the porch gate closed behind Marcus, I thought about the sun and the man and the tidy ledger that had led me to this tender, messy place. The next step was going to be a confrontation that would not only put paper into the record but would force Logan to show the shape of his choices in front of other people. And what came out of that confrontation? A letter in his pocket, a confession in his hand, or the sight of a photograph that changes everything, will determine whether this family repairs the fence or builds a new wall. The meeting at the kitchen table will reveal a document that nobody expected, and that document will change where my loyalty has to stand.
We agreed on a time that felt like a neutral hour, late morning, after the light had warmed the floorboards but before noon's busyness could be used as an excuse. Marcus arrived first, papers tucked under his arm, calm like a man who likes lines to be straight. Henry came with a thermos of bad coffee and a steadying presence. Logan arrived last, not in a suit this time, hands raw as if he'd been gripping something hard. He stepped into the kitchen like a man entering a room he'd once known by memory and found it rearranged. Avery did not come. She sent a message that said she was tied up, which felt convenient and small. The empty chair across from me made the table feel like a stage with a promise missing. We sat down. Marcus with his folder open, Henry folded into a chair like a slow question, Logan with his eyes on his hands. My hands were steady around a mug I warmed out of habit. Marcus began simply and firmly, the kind of start that leaves no room for spectacle. He read the facts aloud, dates, visits, the notarized clause, the wire transfers, Rosa's memo, the drafts. He did it in a voice that kept each number a neutral thing rather than a weapon. When he finished there was a kind of hush, the kind that makes your throat feel full. Then Marcus placed a copy of another paper on the table. It was small, folded into thirds like a handbill. I had seen similar drafts before, but this one was different. It was a short, unsigned note the developers had prepared, a draft of a thank you speech for Logan, praising his leadership in ensuring a smooth transition, and expressing hopes that the family would embrace new opportunities. The note read as if it were written for applause. It had a list of talking points and a suggested timeline for public announcements. It assumed complicity, not conversation. Logan's face changed the second he looked at it. Color left him and his shoulders dropped the way someone finally lets go of a weight. He swallowed hard, then lifted his head and met my eyes with a look that was all apology and the rawness of a man who'd been found out. I knew about drafts, he said, voice small and rough. They showed me some words once. They asked what I might say if things moved forward. I thought if I rehearsed the words it would feel easier. I didn't see how it would look. He inhaled, a sharp, wet sound. Tears came then, not loud but messy, and they moved down his face with the kind of honesty that makes a house hold its breath. He wiped at them with the back of his hand like a child trying to hide a bruise. You knew the transfers were happening, Marcus said, calm but direct. You accepted money that related to the property. You were aware of drafts that assumed your cooperation. Logan's jaw trembled. Yes, he said, I took the money, but not to sell the land. I did it because I was desperate. My son needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. I thought I could steer them, make them feel like this place was safe, keep it all quiet so I didn't have to beg. I see now how foolish and wrong that was. I should have told you. Hearing him say the word surgery made something in the room change shape. My heart, which had been like a fist for days, opened and then closed again, not sure whether it wanted to soothe or strike. The ledger had shown motive, Logan's voice showed pain braided with shame. The two together made a complicated thing that wanted both redress and mercy. Marcus laid out the legal consequences plainly. The transfers could be subpoenaed, the drafts established intent, and a court could easily issue an injunction to prevent any transfer of assets while an investigation proceeded. He also said something that felt like a steadier hand on the shoulder. Given Logan's admission and Rose's testimony, there was an opportunity for a controlled, constructive path forward, not to hide wrongdoing but to make accountability mean something useful. He suggested a restitution plan, a way for Logan to acknowledge the harm while also addressing the medical debt that had pushed him into secret deals. Logan's eyes filled again. He spoke about the boy in a way that made my chest ache, an ordinary kind of love that becomes fierce and clumsy when a child is sick. He said he'd made mistakes, that he hadn't meant to make me a stranger in my own life. He asked, with a voice that broke, if there could be a way to make it right. I felt many things at once. Anger that had been hot and sharp now softened by understanding, a kind of bitter laugh that rose and cracked, and a deep, aching tenderness for the family I'd helped raise. Tears leaked from my eyes without ceremony. I didn't try to hide them. They felt like necessary work, a salt to cleanse in a two-way street between truth and mercy. But there were hard lines I could not erase. Trust, once bent into a ledger, needs proof to be straightened again. Marcus insisted on a formal plan, public documentation of admission, court-ordered preservation of records, and a transparent restitution program supervised by a trustee, someone neutral who could ensure the medical debt was covered without the developers keeping a foothold on the property. He also wanted assurances that any future conversations involving the estate would be recorded and that Avery's involvement in the developers' plans be clarified. Logan agreed to all of it with a relief that sounded like someone removing a weight. He said he would sign an affidavit admitting receipt of the funds and acknowledging his actions. He asked for my help in reaching a solution that would not abandon his family. His hands shook as he wrote, his pen left smudges like small confessions on the paper. After the legal steps were settled, Henry quietly pushed another paper across the table. It was a small, faded photograph he'd found tucked in a box in the study, a picture of Logan when he was a boy, muddy knees and all, standing next to the younger version of me, both of us laughing. The photo hit like a physical thing. The memory it held made our memories less like facts and more like shared weather. I laughed, a short, surprised sound that had grief braided through it, because seeing that younger face reminded me that people can change and unmake and remade in their lives. But the photograph also made the line clear: forgiveness would be conditional. I could help arrange the medical care and accept that a man had been pushed past pride by love. I could not, however, allow a scheme to reshape the estate's destiny. Marcus would file the injunction, subpoena bank records, and prepare for a possible court challenge. We would shield the orchard from predatory timing and misleading narratives. And Logan would begin repayment through the restitution plan, overseen by the trustee Marcus suggested. We closed the meeting with a kind of tiredness that felt like the end of a long shift. Logan stood at the door a long time before he left, as if the porch itself required penance. He turned back once, voice small and raw. "I'm sorry," he said. The word was thin but honest. I watched him walk down the lane, shoulders bent as if the world were heavier than it had been when he arrived. As the front door closed, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. A chapter had moved from secret to spoken, and that change both freed and fractured the next steps. I knew the legal engines would now run their slow, steady way. I also knew we had crossed into a place where choices would matter not just for property but for whether this family could ever sit at the same table without counting the cost. There was one final, small sound before Marcus left, a soft, confident knock at the neighbor's gate. Someone had seen the cars, the meetings. The world was narrowing and watching. The next moves would involve lawyers and bank subpoenas, but they would also involve people: Logan's agreement to restitution, Avery's silence becoming a choice she'd have to justify, Rose's courage to stand if called, and my own decision about where to keep my heart when trust had been so thoroughly tested. In the next part you'll learn how the injunction plays out, how the developers push back in public ways, and what surprise evidence suggests that someone else pulled a longer string behind the scenes. Marcus filed the injunction that same week. The papers felt heavy in my hands, formal, dry, and oddly comforting because they made the chaos look like a thing you could point to. Step by step we did what he said: draft the petition with dates and exhibits attached, the notarized clause, the will updates, the emails, the wire transfers, Rose's memo, and Logan's admission. Request an emergency hearing to freeze any transfers or contracts connected to the orchard. serve the injunction and a preservation order so nothing could be deleted, shredded, or quietly moved. The court clerk stamped the order with a clear, loud thunk that sounded for a second like victory. Ha ha ha. It felt a little like that, ridiculous, small, and enormous all at once. The injunction was not a final judgment, it was a pause button. It gave us time to make the truth plain. At first the world outside our gate reacted like a pond after a stone is thrown, ripples, then harder waves. The developers pushed back with the predictable tools of power, a public relations firm, a tidy press release, and talking points given to local reporters. Their message was simple and practiced. The estate needed modernization, the community supported new jobs, Marin was resisting necessary progress. They painted the story as if preservation and profit were opposites and someone had to be the reasonable adult. The first time I read one of their pieces in the town paper my mouth went dry. The headline used words like stubborn and out of touch. The article quoted anonymous sources, neighbors who suddenly remembered how the orchard had fallen behind. I felt my cheeks flush hot and hollow at once. AWH. The burn of being reshaped in other people's words hit me like a slap. Social media followed. A tidy set of photos appeared online with captions suggesting the estate had been neglected, showing close-ups of peeling paint and overgrown hedges out of season. I knew those places intimately. I had kneaded the soil with my own hands. Seeing them cropped and captioned felt like watching someone sell a memory you'd sewn into your bones. People I'd known for years sent polite notes of concern. A few called to offer help. Most forwarded the article and asked, gently, curiously, if maybe it was time to consider change. The noise was a pressure, slow and steady, that makes people doubt the story they live inside. Marcus expected this. He nodded when I read him the clips. They'll try to make the narrative public before the facts are, he said. His voice was even, flat with experience. So we make our facts louder. Step by step he instructed what came next. File a rebuttal with the court showing the appraisal we'd commissioned, the maintenance receipts, and the accountant's statement that the property was not the sinkhole they claimed. We would also file Rose's affidavit, Logan's signed admission, and the subpoenaed bank records that matched the wire transfers. The law would speak in paper and numbers, our job was to put them where people could see. But the developers didn't just use hype. Someone leaked an old, private letter from a friend of the family, a note meant to be personal, repurposed to suggest my judgment was clouded by sentiment. Another anonymous poster suggested I was too old to manage the place, planting the idea of incapacity. The tone shifted from business to personal, and the country comfort of polite neighbors cooled into distance. I felt it physically. Friends who used to drop by no longer stopped for tea. People stepped off the porch as if the gate now carried a new rule. That isolation burned differently than the theft. It was a coldness that made the house echo. I found myself speaking aloud to the rooms sometimes, as if the house could answer. Ha ha ha. I laughed then, the sound small and startled, because talking to walls felt ridiculous and necessary. Tears came often. Sometimes I would sit at the kitchen table and weep until my throat smoothed, a slow, cleansing sound. The work of law is not always loud, it is often a steady, lonely march of forms and dates. But in the quiet between filings the world found ways to make you feel naked. We responded carefully. Marcus filed counter-evidence. Henry arranged for neighbors who had helped me with harvests to sign short statements about the house's condition and the care I gave it. Rosa agreed to a sworn affidavit that laid out the developer meetings in the memo, and Marcus moved to make her testimony part of the court record. Logan's affidavit admitted his actions and asked the court to consider his motives, the child's medical needs, while not excusing the deception. We sent a short factual statement to local papers that steered clear of drama. The injunction had been filed, the matter was in court, and the estate would not be sold or altered while proceedings were ongoing. Simplicity can be stubborn, sometimes a short sentence is the warmest kind of shield. The public pushback got louder anyway. Someone began calling the house at odd hours with cruel questions and suggestions, a mechanical voice repeating a phrase about legacy backwardness. The calls were the kind you hang up on, but they add up, a drip that wears at the edges. I blocked numbers, changed voicemail greetings, and made sure the porch lights stayed on at night. Ha ha ha, my life had become a string of small security measures that felt both silly and essential. Each added lock and filed subpoena tightened a safe space around the truth like bandages. Then, a twist arrived in the mail that felt like a cold hand on the neck. In an envelope with no return address there was a photograph, not flattering, not cruel, just factual. It showed two men in a small, nondescript office with a municipal letterhead visible on the desk. One of the men was a representative of the developers. The other was a town official, a man I recognized from municipal meetings who had publicly praised development as good for jobs. The photograph was taken at a time when the town official had no recorded reason to meet with the developers. The timeline suggested an unrecorded conversation that could explain how the PR campaign had been so tightly aligned with municipal messaging. This kind of evidence is the sort that tilts a story. It implies networks and favors, the kind of thing that makes people say, "Oh, everyone knows how it works, except when you need proof." I handed the photo to Marcus and watched his face pull into lines. He said, quietly, "This makes it bigger." I felt a cold mixture of vindication and dread. Bigger meant longer fights, more names on files, and the slow unspooling of relationships I'd assumed were steady. As the injunction held and the first subpoenas went out, the town's chatter turned into a background hum. Some neighbors came forward with small kindnesses. A basket left on the porch, a call from an old friend who said simply, "I remember when you taught me to prune those trees." AWH. Those moments felt like stitches. They held me up in the slow days between court dates. The support was not a grand answer but a series of gentle, practical things that kept the house from feeling abandoned. At the same time, the developers escalated in private. We learned they had hired investigators to locate other papers, to find any document that would embarrass me or show mismanagement. The investigators dredged through old records and asked pointed questions of long-silent staff. Their method was to find a single weakness and magnify it into a justification for everything. Marcus moved to block that effort, demanding preservation of records and threatening contempt for any deliberate destruction. I lay awake some nights feeling the quiet tear of community loosen its threads. Ha ha ha. Sometimes the laugh that comes is not happy, it's a way to make a sound where betrayal has made you mute. I practiced patience the way one practices a craft, daily, with small marks of progress. Each court filing, each affidavit, each neighbor's short note was a stitch in a garment meant to keep the orchard wrapped from greedy hands. And then, right when the court calendar was filling with dates and the town papers ran another op-ed about progress, an unexpected person reached out. An old friend of my father's, someone I had not seen in years, sent a packet with a letter and a set of ledgers. The ledgers contained entries that tied the developers to an older pattern of buying influence in neighboring towns. That pattern suggested this was not just a single attempt but a play pulled from a rehearsed book. That discovery widened the fight. It meant we were not just defending land, we were standing against a system that used charm and money to rewrite other people's lives. Marcus read through the ledgers with a face that was quiet and hard. He filed a motion to expand the subpoena, to pull records from the developers' partners and the municipal office. The case moved from a family quarrel into something that smelled like public interest. But bigger fights ask more of you. The public began to watch, opinions split into camps, and our lives lost the simple rhythm they once had. The orchard still bloomed, indifferent and brave, but now it was a stage. I found I could not look at it the same way and not look away. Tears came sometimes, sudden and raw, and sometimes laughter bubbled up when I found a bird's nest where I'd thought winter had taken its chance. Next, someone close to Avery will make a desperate move that changes the legal landscape, and a hidden ledger will surface that ties the whole scheme to a figure no one expected. They came at dawn with paper and urgency like a storm you didn't see forming. Claire, Avery's cousin, the one who'd grown up visiting the orchard and knew the secret paths, appeared at my gate with a stack of forms and a face made small by panic. She said she couldn't watch the family tear itself apart. She said she was acting to protect everyone. Her hands trembled as she handed over an affidavit alleging that I'd been showing signs of confusion, that lately I'd made uncharacteristic decisions, and that my neighbors had been concerned for my ability to manage the estate. It hit like a physical shove. I read the affidavit twice because it felt unreal, a stranger's voice pretending to be an old friend. In legal terms it was clear, an affidavit like that can be the opening ticket for a conservatorship or emergency guardianship hearing. If someone convinced a judge that I was no longer capable of making decisions, they could appoint a conservator with temporary power to manage the property. That power, even temporarily, could let the developers move faster than court injunctions could stop them. Claire spoke quickly, as if words could make her lighter. She said she didn't know about the transfers or the drafts, she only wanted the family to be safe. AWH. The voice she used to say it made my chest ache because I had once trusted her like family. Trust cracked into 100 lines. Marcus read the affidavit and didn't yell. He kept his face flat and patient and then laid out what this meant in plain terms. Emergency guardianship petitions are often fast and messy. Judges act quickly when presented with medical-sounding claims. The thing to do was not to react with anger but to react with documentation and facts that the court respects. Recent medical records, sworn statements from physicians, and evidence of daily competency. He called my doctor and asked for a certified copy of my recent checkup, the same one I'd ordered when all this started. He asked Henry to prepare a sworn declaration that the notarized clause and my actions showed deliberate, ongoing control of the estate. Step by step, he explained how to counter this. Put the health facts on the record, file an opposition immediately, and subpoena anyone offering evidence of incapacity to produce specifics. We moved at the speed Marcus demanded. Step 1. Certified medical records from my doctor, done. Step 2. A sworn affidavit from my physician saying there is no evidence of cognitive decline, done. Step 3. Affidavits from neighbors who have seen me manage the orchard tasks, pruning, bookkeeping, scheduling contractors, done. Step 4. A chronology of events showing I had handled estate matters deliberately, the deed, the notarized clause, the updated will, my calls to the lawyer, and my copies of bank statements, all assembled and labeled. Marcus filed an emergency response that same afternoon. But legal strategy is not the whole story. Emotion ate at the edges. Claire's name felt like a bruise. Ha ha ha. Sometimes the only sound that comes when people you thought were steady bend is a laugh that isn't happy. I called her and she sobbed. She said she'd been scared, that she'd listened to developers' people who told her I was out of touch, that she'd believed them because they had paperwork. Her voice was full of weeping and regret. She said she had meant to help, not to harm. Hearing her, a complicated softness softened me. Hearing the affidavit on file, a fierce coldness hardened my resolve. People make mistakes. Paper can be used to make those mistakes lethal. Then the ledger arrived, not quietly, not politely, but like a bomb wrapped in old paper. It was a photocopy of a financial record book from the developer's private files that an anonymous courier left at Henry's office. The ledger listed a string of payments and, under a column labeled Municipal Liaison, showed regular deposits into an account that linked back, via an intermediary, to the mayor's office, Mayor Thornton, a man known for ribbon cuttings and speeches about progress. The ledger suggested ongoing donations and support payments, routed in ways meant to look charitable. The pattern matched the photograph we'd already received of the developer meeting with the town official, but now there was a paper trail that made the photograph more than a snapshot. It made it a part of a system. Marcus looked at the ledger and breathed out like someone who'd seen a bigger net being pulled taut. This ties the developers to municipal influence, he said. It changes the scope from private pressure to public collusion. That phrase, public collusion, sat in the kitchen like a new, sharp smell. Why did that matter now? 2 reasons, both practical and legal. First, if municipal officials were quietly aligned with the developers. The courtroom was packed. You could feel it before you even stepped inside, the heat of bodies, the tension, the curiosity. When a private fight becomes public, people show up like they're watching a storm from the porch. Some wanted justice. Some wanted gossip. Some just wanted to see someone fall. I sat at the front, hands locked in my lap. My palms were cold even though the room was warm. Marcus leaned slightly toward me and whispered only one thing, steady. The judge called the case, and suddenly all sounds felt sharp, the rustle of paper, a cough from the gallery, the click of a reporter's pen. The injunction, the guardianship affidavit, the ledger, the photograph, all of it was now evidence waiting to breathe. The witness no one expected. Marcus stood first, calm as stone. He called Rosa, the employee who had written the memo about the developer meeting months ago. She walked to the stand with shoulders tight but spine straight. Her voice shook at first, but it strengthened with every sentence. She spoke about the conversations she overheard, about the draft sale agreement, prepared before anyone asked me a thing, about the meeting where a developer said quietly, confidently, the old woman will sign, she just doesn't know it yet. The room didn't breathe. I almost didn't either. Then came the ledger. Marcus laid it down like a card you only play once. He asked Rosa if she recognized certain names. She did. The developer's representative, the mayor's aide, a consultant who once visited the orchard pretending to assess environmental impact. The judge leaned forward, no longer passive. The air changed. You could feel it like a shift in weather, silent but undeniable. The defense pushed back. The developer's lawyer objected, called the ledger anonymous, unverified. They said anyone could forge numbers. They tried to paint Rosa as emotional, suggest she misheard, misremembered. Then Marcus dropped the second thread. He had subpoenaed bank confirmations, and they matched entries in the ledger to the dollar. A low ripple moved through the gallery, the sound of doubt turning into belief. The judge ordered the municipal emails released. You could see the defense wince like someone feeling light for the first time after hiding in shadows. They tried one last tactic, the guardianship angle. They presented Claire's affidavit, said it showed concern, responsibility, foresight. They wanted the judge to consider granting temporary control to prevent mismanagement. Marcus didn't even raise his voice. He handed the judge my medical certification, clear, current, firm. He handed over statements from neighbors who saw me working, balancing books, fixing shutters. He pointed to every document I had notarized, filed, stored, backed up. Then he said one sentence that felt like a hand on my life. Competence is not in question. What is in question is who is trying to take her voice. Silence hit harder than any shout. The judge's ruling. The judge denied the guardianship petition on the spot. The gavel struck wood, once, clean and final. The injunction was extended. The developers were ordered to turn over full records. The mayor's office was placed under investigation. And for the first time since this began, I felt something return, something I thought I'd lost. Not victory, not triumph, something quieter, something warmer, my own name in my own hands again. AWH. Tears came right there in the courtroom. Real, relieved, shaking tears. And when I laughed, it wasn't bitter or broken. It sounded like a window opening after months of rain. Ha ha ha, soft, human, alive. But this wasn't the end. Power never folds neatly. The backlash was coming, and with evidence spreading like fire, people who once hid behind offices began to panic. Next comes the part where secrets spill wider, money trails stretch across counties, and the person behind everything, the real architect, finally steps into the light. After the ruling, the town didn't quiet, it crackled. Truth, once freed, behaves like electricity. It jumps, it burns, it lights places that preferred the dark. Reporters dug deeper, neighbors whispered names, emails surfaced, then more ledgers. Each one painted a wider network, one that reached beyond developers, beyond the mayor, beyond quiet dinner conversations in offices after closing hours. And then we saw it. In the newest file release, tucked between budget approvals and property drafts, was a signature that didn't belong. State Senator Dalton, a polished man with a clean record, loved by cameras, praised for community development initiatives. He visited fairs, shook hands, spoke like progress itself wore a tie. He had never once visited the orchard, not publicly, yet his initials appeared beside payments, authorizations, and talking points used to frame our estate as economically inefficient land. It wasn't the developers who orchestrated everything. It was him. He wanted the orchard as proof of his development vision, a showpiece deal to wave before election season. The developers were just his hands. The mayor, his voice. News outlets, his megaphones. And in a folder labeled Private Strategy, we found a single typed sentence. Acquire estate through incapacity route if voluntary transfer fails. A route, not an accident, not misunderstanding, a planned method to make me small enough to move. When Marcus read it, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, calmly, almost coldly, we don't just defend now. We prosecute. The shift in momentum. For the first time, we weren't reacting, we were advancing. Marcus drafted a civil suit naming the senator, the developers, and the mayor's office for conspiracy to defraud, attempted unlawful seizure of property, coordinated defamation, elder exploitation strategy planning. He filed motions for discovery that reached far beyond our gates, into campaign donations, consulting payments, city contracts. Suddenly every person involved had to produce records. No one likes opening drawers they kept shut. Phones in their offices began to ring. Some aides resigned overnight. The mayor stopped giving public statements. And Senator Dalton, the man who thought we were just one orchard in a long line of trophies, held a press conference where his smile looked too tight, too bright. He denied everything, of course. But denial sounds thin when paper speaks. The community begins to return. Little by little, the same neighbors who once sent me articles now brought warm bread, fruit baskets, quiet apologies. Not all, but some. The orchard felt different now, not just land under threat, but ground people stood for. Children ran past the fence again. Someone left a jar of jam with no note. A whistling man repaired a loose gate hinge without being asked. Small stitches. But stitches heal. I laughed more freely now, sometimes at nothing, sometimes at everything. Tears still came, soft and warm rather than sharp. Relief and grief lived together like siblings learning to share a room. Because winning pieces back doesn't erase what it cost. It just gives breath back to a body that almost forgot how to breathe. And then, a letter arrived. Handwritten, sealed in wax, delivered by a courier with no name given. Inside was one line. You have moved further than you know. But there is someone closer than Dalton, someone you still trust. Watch your left. No signature, no explanation, just that, a warning, or a threat. Someone near us wasn't what they appeared. And as the case grew louder and the walls of power cracked wider, the quiet question sharpened like a blade. Who beside me was wearing a friendly face over borrowed loyalty? Because betrayals don't always come from enemies. Sometimes they arrive from the same hands that pour your tea. The letter didn't scare me at first. It annoyed me. It felt like someone reaching into my life with dirty hands, dramatic, vague, clever in the way people are when they think mystery gives them power. But later that night, sitting on the porch with the orchard breathing quietly around me, the words began to settle deeper. Someone closer than Dalton. Someone I still trusted. Watch your left. I replayed every conversation from the past weeks, every voice that sounded supportive, every person who said, "You'll be fine, don't worry," every small kindness that arrived too perfectly timed. At first my mind resisted. You don't want to believe betrayal grows inside your own walls. But something small inside me, that old instinct you get when life teaches you the hard way, whispered, "Look anyway." The shift begins at breakfast. The next morning, Marcus came early. He brought fresh documents, coffee, and a tired smile. We sat at the table while the sunlight slid across the wood like warm water. He explained the next steps. Depositions, witness lists, financial subpoenas widening. I listened, but then something in his wording made me pause. He said, "Dalton's people are already preparing a counter-narrative. They'll try to make you look unpredictable. We'll need more details about your routines, communications, and any personal struggles you might have had this year." The way he said it wasn't wrong. It was normal legal thinking. But it was also something else, a tone that felt too careful. Like he was shaping me into a witness, not a client. I brushed it off. Until noon. A detail that didn't fit. Henry arrived later with copies of older estate papers. He set a heavy folder on the table, then frowned at the thick envelope beside my notebook. He tapped it. "What's this one?" "The letter from the courier," I said. Henry stiffened, almost too fast. Then he said, lightly, "Probably someone trying to stir fear. You shouldn't take anonymous things seriously. Keep all attention on the case." It was the way he said shouldn't. Soft, but firm, like steering a horse by the jaw. And then, a small thing cracked open. As he flipped the pages of an old file, I saw a signature on the corner of a memo. I knew the signature. It belonged to the consultant who had visited the orchard months ago, pretending to assess land value. And right beside the consultant's name was another line. Legal advisor, H.M. Henry Morris. His initials. For a moment I didn't breathe. I stared at the letters until they looked like scratches in the paper. Henry had worked with them, at least once. Maybe more. He had told me it was nothing. He had told me he never knew the developer's deeper plans. He had said he only helped with public paperwork. But his initials were sitting on a document used to justify zoning changes that would make selling easier. A simple explanation? Maybe. Lawyers advise on many things. But the warning in the letter rang louder now. Watch your left. Someone you trust. Closer than Dalton. The confrontation that didn't feel like one. I didn't accuse him. Not then. Instead, I watched. Henry avoided looking at the ledger Marcus had left on the table. He never asked to see the letter again. And when I mentioned the subpoena against Dalton, he responded with a strange softness. "Be careful how far you push. Big people push back." That was not something a man on my side should say. That was something someone worried about the other side would say. AWH. The hurt came quietly this time. Not sharp. Just sad. Like a bruise you press with your thumb to check if it still hurts. The moment the truth sharpened. Later that night, I received an email from the clerk's office, routine document updates. But one thing in the thread stood out. A confidential motion had been requested, on behalf of the estate's previous legal counsel. Filed 2 weeks ago, before Henry had given me the father's letter. Before he'd returned to help. The motion asked the court to consider alternative estate representatives if prolonged litigation created risk to property value. It was Henry's name on that motion. Not the developers, not Dalton, not the mayor. Henry, the man who used to bring tomatoes from his garden. The man who taught my father how to notarize his own copies. The man who sat in my kitchen and read my father's words beside me. My breath left my chest like someone had opened a door in winter. The fourth player wasn't a stranger. He was family by history. He was a trusted fixture. He was the one person I never examined. The letter's warning wasn't dramatic after all. It was accurate. Henry began to change without saying a word. He watched everyone more closely now. He listened, but not like before. His eyes stayed still, sharp, like someone measuring distance before making a move. And the house, once full of silent tension, now felt like it was breathing against its own walls. Evelyn noticed it first. Henry's questions became shorter. His smile faded at the edges. He stayed awake at night longer than anyone, sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee he never finished. Olivia tried to trust him, but something inside her whispered, "You're missing something." The motive begins to unravel. Henry was not there by accident. His kindness wasn't pure generosity. He was watching them because he needed something, but he had not yet revealed what. One night, Olivia passed by the half-closed study door. Henry sat inside, reading old letters, documents, things no one should have access to. She froze. One page clearly carried Evelyn's late husband's signature. Another had bank details, numbers she remembered from an inheritance no one discussed aloud. Henry was not just present. He was digging into history. Their history. Loyalties break. Evelyn felt betrayed, even though she wasn't sure by who. Olivia felt torn. Henry had saved her once, but now she did not know what side he stood on. And someone else in the shadows, the fourth player, finally began to stir. Because Henry's digging woke something old. Something unfinished. The house, for the first time, was no longer quiet. It was waiting. The house felt heavier that morning, like the walls themselves had absorbed whispers and were holding them in, waiting for someone to listen. Henry arrived early, his steps quieter than usual. He carried a leather briefcase, worn but neat, and a look that didn't match the calm he always tried to show. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window, her fingers tightening around her mug. She could feel it. The quiet tension wasn't just in her imagination. Something had shifted. He didn't greet her with his usual easy smile. Instead, he set the briefcase on the dining table and opened it with precise, careful movements. Inside were stacks of documents she recognized, and some she didn't. Bills, contracts, letters, photographs. And at the very top, a folder marked private. Her name was on it in a familiar, deliberate handwriting. Henry spoke, calm but measured. "These are things you need to see. Your family's estate, the past few years, some decisions have been made without your knowledge." Evelyn felt her stomach twist. Decisions without her knowledge? She had always thought she was in control. Always thought she knew where loyalty lived in this house. But as Henry laid out the papers, showing transfers, loans, and signatures, a sick realization spread through her chest. Someone had been moving pieces behind the scenes, someone she had trusted. And then came the final document. It wasn't a contract, a bill, or a deed. It was a letter, folded carefully, written in the same steady hand as her father's. But the signature at the bottom was different. Someone else had signed it, someone she had never imagined. Her breath caught. That's when the fourth player appeared. Not in person yet, but the evidence of their presence was undeniable. Every alteration, every secret move, every carefully timed action traced back to a single, unseen orchestrator. The person who had been waiting, watching, calculating, ready to step into the light when the time was perfect. Henry glanced up from the papers, catching her expression. "I didn't forge these," he said quietly. "I only followed instructions." But the instructions came from someone unexpected. Evelyn's mind raced. Who had the audacity, the patience, the access to manipulate everything from the shadows? And what did they want? Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the porch like a warning. Inside, the house seemed to lean closer, listening. The next move would decide everything. Alliances, trust, and the fragile control Evelyn thought she held were all about to be tested. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, cutting lines of gold across the worn wooden floor. Evelyn felt the weight of the house pressing closer, each familiar shadow suddenly alien, each creak in the boards a whisper of warning. The fourth player had arrived, not in a whisper or rumor, but in the air itself, in the careful precision of everything Henry had laid out. A knock came at the front door, slow, deliberate. Evelyn's hand hovered over the handle, heart thrumming like a bird trapped in a cage. She opened it, and there they were, tall, calm, impossible to read. The air between them was taut, as if the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting for acknowledgement. The person spoke first, voice low and measured. "Evelyn Holt," they said, a smile that didn't touch their eyes. "We finally meet." Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle, but she didn't let them. Instead, she held the door firmly, her own voice steady but sharp. I know who you are, she said. And I know what you've been doing. The fourth player's smile widened ever so slightly. I've only been patient. Watching, waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment, they said, letting their gaze sweep across the room, is now. Inside, Henry shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty and fear. His calm veneer cracked, just slightly, revealing that he had not been fully in control. Evelyn could see it. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the messenger, the executor, the cautious accomplice. You've been hiding in shadows, Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength with each word. Manipulating, twisting, pulling strings while pretending to help. But I see you now. The fourth player's eyes flickered, almost impressed. You're sharper than I expected, they admitted. Then, as if to underline the gravity of the moment, they placed a single folder on the table. Everything you think is secure, everything you hold dear, depends on how you respond. Evelyn's pulse raced. She reached out, lifting the folder with trembling hands. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, proof of long-hidden alliances, betrayals, and schemes that spanned years. Every piece connected, every secret revealed, painting a map of manipulation she hadn't anticipated. The room fell silent, the weight of the house pressing down. For a moment, Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, anger, disbelief, and something raw, like the ache of betrayal she had carried quietly for years. But she steadied herself, drawing a deep breath, feeling the key around her neck pulse against her chest. This was her house, her legacy, her decision to make. The fourth player tilted their head. Decide wisely, they said. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Evelyn looked around, at Henry, at the house, at the orchard beyond the windows, swaying gently in the wind. She thought of every sacrifice, every silent moment of vigilance, every careful step she had taken to protect what was hers. She folded the folder with deliberate care. Then we start here, she said, voice steady, quiet but filled with a fire that could not be ignored. No more shadows, no more secrets. Every move from now on is mine. The battle lines are drawn. Every secret revealed demands action, every loyalty tested. Evelyn steps fully into the role of protector, but the fourth player isn't done yet. The next chapter will see schemes clash, trust fracture, and the quiet war erupt into open confrontation. The house finally exhaled, not with doors closing or keys turning, but with the quiet recognition that the storm had passed, at least for now. Evelyn stood on the porch, the key around her neck warm against her skin, the orchard stretching endlessly before her, alive with sunlight and possibility. Henry was there, but not in the role of orchestrator or messenger. He was just a man who had made mistakes, finally humbled by the truth. They didn't speak much, sometimes silence carries more than words, but he stayed, helping without expectation, proving that redemption doesn't need fanfare. The fourth player had left, retreating into the shadows they had once commanded, their presence now reduced to memory and caution. Evelyn didn't celebrate, didn't mock, they had been clever, relentless, but the weight of fear had lifted. She had won not through confrontation, but through patience, clarity, and the unshakable knowledge of her own authority. In the orchard, the trees swayed gently. Petals drifted in the wind like confetti, light and unburdened. Evelyn walked the rows slowly, her hands brushing against the leaves, the soil grounding her, reminding her that she belonged here. Every vine, every branch, every root was hers, not because of contracts or legal claims, but because she had held them with care, honesty, and courage. That evening, she poured tea, this time for herself and Henry, and sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the orchard in gold and amber. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. There was peace in simply being present, in knowing the land was safe, the legacy intact, and the future hers to shape. As stars appeared overhead, Evelyn thought of every moment that had led to this, every betrayal, every shadow, every fear she had faced alone. And for the first time in years, she smiled, not bitterly, not cautiously, but fully, because she had endured, protected, and prevailed. The orchard breathed with her, alive with possibility, a quiet testament to resilience, wisdom, and the power of standing firm. The key rested against her heart, a symbol not of control, but of belonging. And somewhere in the wind, it whispered, "This is home." The orchard was quiet now, alive with sunlight and the soft rustle of leaves. Evelyn stood on the porch, the key warm against her chest, every branch and vine a reminder of what she had fought to protect.
Henry lingered nearby, no longer a master of schemes, just a witness to her steadfastness. The fourth player had vanished into shadows, leaving only the truth and the calm after the storm. She poured tea, breathed in the scent of blossoms, and for the first time in years, smiled, fully, unguarded, because she had endured, defended, and prevailed. The orchard swayed with the wind, whispering its approval. This was hers, and it always had been.